Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, and we're going to be providing an update to the bull market support band. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go to jump in. So it is Tuesday, July 2nd. Of course, by the time this video is out, it'll probably be closer to Wednesday. But let's check in with the bull market support band. You can see that the 20-week SMA is quite a bit higher than where we currently are. It's up at all the way up at 65.3K, which is actually somewhat reminiscent of 2023 in terms of the extension from the 20-week SMA. We'll talk a little bit about that later. But last week, we still had a weekly close above the 21-week EMA. Now, this week, the 21-week EMA is at 61.4K. And of course, right now, we are slightly below that. So again, I mean, no one cares about wicks. You know, we've had plenty of wicks before, and we even had some weekly closes before that went below the bull market support band. But this is where, it's that 20-week SMA, 21-week EMA is where this is where you would expect for the bulls to try to hold the line, right, at these levels. And if you go look at what happened previously, if you look at some of these daily candles, back over here in May, you can see that Bitcoin actually did fall into these levels right around that 60 to 61K level before getting a bounce. It actually sold back off, right? If you look at this red candle right here on May 14th, we actually sold back off to around 61K. And then the following day, we went up to 66.5K, right? I mean, that was a big move in one day. We also kind of came down to similar levels, obviously a wick lower, but still finding a lot of that support around that 60 to 61K level. Big move up, right? Sell off. You can see this move up over here went all the way up to around 63.5K. This one right here went up to around 63.8K. So it went a little bit higher. The main difference between where we are right now and where we were back over here was that back over here, we were still above the bull market support band. Now we're actually below it. Again, at this point, it's still not a weekly close, right? Now, you might say, well, we are below the 20-week SMA, and you're right. And if you look at the extension, if you take the natural log of the price over the 20-week moving average, you can see that it has, in fact, turned red because we are below the 20-week SMA, just like we were in Q3 of 2023, in fact. So it's almost lining up in a very similar fashion, right? Where you're maybe just a month ahead. Kind of like, I mean, if you think about it, I mean, we did sweep the high in June, but if you look at this was an April top. Here, it was a March top, right? Back over here, it took until August to get below that but below the 20-week SMA. Now we got below it in, June, right? Late June, early July. So I would say that's the main difference between, back over in April and where we are today. Same levels, but now we're below the 20-week moving average. So again, the bulls would want to reclaim that as soon as possible to keep the trend intact, right? To keep the trend intact. If they're not able to reclaim it, then, maybe you end up going back down and retesting one of these trends. I mean, you can see that Bitcoin ultimately retested this or sort of set this trend line back in Q3 of 2023. You could see something similar happen again. If the bulls are able to hold the line, right? If they're able to hold the line in the short term, your main area of resistance would be the 20-week moving average, which coincidentally happens to correspond to around the 8-week moving average. So if we throw the 8-week estimate onto the chart, you will see, in fact, that you have the 8-week SMA and the 20-week SMA essentially converging to the same price. The 8-week is at 65.8K. The 20-week is at 65.3K. So that's where you're going to want to look. We've made this comparison to Bitcoin to both 2016 and 2019. Obviously, structurally, there's a lot of similars to 2016. And even if you look at say, like the ROI after the halving, right? If you go look at the ROI after the halving, I think a lot of people always just think of the halving. They think Bitcoin goes just up only after the halving, because if you look at halving cycles 1 and 3, that's what happened, right? Bitcoin only went up after the halving. Like, I mean, basically, it didn't go back below the price at which it was at the halving. But if you look at halving cycle 2 and now halving cycle 4, you can see that it's opposite, right? I mean, we actually went down after the halving, and that's one reason that maybe making that comparison to 2016 makes sense. And if you also go look at 2016, there were definitely times, there were definitely times in 2016 where Bitcoin got below that 8-week SMA and even had wicks below the 20-week moving average. Now, there's not a lot of examples where you had weekly closes below the 20-week moving average, which is where we are right now, right? So again, it's similar to 2016, but it's not the exact same thing. It's also similar to 2019, but it's not the exact same thing. But if you look at 2019, you also had sort of these 3 lower highs. You finally got below that 8-week SMA. You started to wick below the 20-week, and then eventually you just fell well below that bull market support band, and then you end up going back up to it and holding resistance at it. And then you, of course, had the pandemic crash. So definitely a lot of things to consider there. There's also other things you can look at, like USDT dominance, which we've mentioned a few times. It's still at that trend line, by the way, or it's still staying above that trend line. So I would keep an eye on that. That was something we talked about way back in March when we hit this trend line. We said before we're likely going to find, that 4% level. We did, and then USDT dominance bounced off of that. And now, while Bitcoin is inching below its 20-week moving average, you can see that USDT dominance is sort of inching above its bull market support band. So it's just one more thing to keep an eye on here to see if this trend actually picks back up going in the opposite direction. But in the meantime, Bitcoin has not yet had a weekly close below the bull market support band. It has been below the 20-week SMA, but remember, the bull market support band is a band, right? It's not just one moving average. It's the 20-week SMA and the 21-week EMA. And there are plenty of examples where you close below one but not the other, and the trend is intact. So far, we have not yet had a weekly close below the bull market support band. We had a wick below it last week, but even though we had a wick below it, we still closed above the 21-week EMA, even though it was below the 20-week SMA that week and the prior week. So in the short term, what I would look for Bitcoin is if it holds these levels, right? If it holds 60K plus or minus a couple $1,000 and it bounces, can it actually get past the 20-week SMA and the 8-week SMA on a durable time frame, right? If it can, then it would be more 2016-esque. If it can't, and it sort of is fading right before rate cuts arrive, like 2019, then you would expect only moves above the bull market support band would only, or above the 8-week SMA would only be a wick. If you look at 2019, those first moves that were rallies were still above the 8-week SMA. But after you got sort of 3 red weeks in a row and you got 1 green week, all of these moves were still only wicks above that 8-week SMA. So that's why I would say, if we are able to get back above the 8-week SMA, does it have a weekly close above it like 2016, or is it like 2019 where you see it only wick back above it? The one thing that I would keep an eye on, and one of the reasons why you'll often see Bitcoin sort of fade can be when yields, when the long end of the yield curve is starting to rise. And if you overlay the US 10-year, we talked a lot about a summer lull, right? I mean, if this is the first time you heard about it, you haven't been watching this channel because we talked about it for months. We talked about it back in March and April that we would likely get a summer lull. And now it's, we're already like, at least a month into the summer, and price action has been relatively boring. But if you look at the 10-year yield, what you'll notice is that when the 10-year yield is really spiking, like it was back over here, really starting in like, July and going into October, that was when Bitcoin was fading. And if you look at the year before, when it was spiking into October, that was when Bitcoin was fading. And so if the 10-year yield is starting to spike here again into October, that could correspond with Bitcoin just showing some of that seasonal weakness. So again, I would watch the yield curve. I do think it is important. It's been inverted. Now, the 2-year and the 10-year have been inverted for 2 years now. The Fed's paused for about a year now. So it has been a long time. So we know there are long and variable lags. So let's just see, is there some type of seasonal weakness by Bitcoin as you get out into Q3 if the 10-year yield is going back up? Remember, if Bitcoin holds 60 to 61K in the short term, your main area to look at is going to be 65, 66K, which that's where the 8-week and the 20-week SMA are. And also, I would be remiss if I didn't at least point out, because I know everyone keeps asking about it, because it hasn't been doing that hot recently. Look, I know the Bitcoin dominance hasn't been, you know, going up as much the last few weeks, but look, it still is above the bull market support band. So it's got that going for it, which is nice. We'll go ahead and wrap it up there. Thank you guys for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe, give the video a thumbs up. And again, check out Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. We do have 3 premium videos per week on there where we talk more about other markets as well. We'll go ahead and wrap it up. I will see you guys next time. Bye.